Do this Veterans Peace Forum every fourth Saturday of the month. We'd like to dedicate this program to Ted Kaiser. He was a Vietnam veteran and a long history with Veterans for Peace and with Native American issues throughout his life. Photographer, a great human being, and he just passed away within the last few weeks, and I didn't have the exact date with me today, so I apologize for that. But it's anytime we lose a veteran and a person that's so close to all of us in this chapter, it has a profound effect upon us. And as any veteran who passes away, it affects us because we know how hard it's been just to live with the idea that there is war going on throughout this world and that they've dedicated their life to try and end war, and that we haven't been able to do it before we pass away. It seems like it might be futile, but actually he did so many good things for the community, and he left a great legacy behind, and we stand on his shoulders and the shoulders of everybody that went before him. And I just want to say, presente, Ted Kaiser. You'll always be remembered. Thank you. Today we have a great show. As you know, the news has been, there's so many different things that are going on. It's hard to keep up with what's going on. Your own lives as just working class people in this world, where we have to struggle with our day-to-day lives, going to work, coming back for very little money at times, just to pay the bills. Veterans, we deal with veteran suicides, that people who are dying because they can't take living in this world anymore. And we're up to like 22 suicides a day for veterans in this country. So it's important. And as we look around, we've dealt with the issues of what's going on in the Ukraine, and I have very little knowledge of that. I'm often invested in the issues that affect people in Vietnam, Agent Orange. I'm involved with with VFP on a national scale called Full Disclosure, in which this is the 50th anniversary of the, depending on the dates that people look, of the Vietnam War. And the DOD is, the Department of Defense, has some $30 to $60 million for a 13-year campaign to basically whitewash that history. And today we're going to talk about history in some ways. Part of that history is the history of the Ukraine. Part of that history is very recent, and the news that's supposed to be informing us, but is very confusing about what's going on in the Ukraine. It's the title of the program today. Basically, is the U.S. versus Russia and a tug of war with the Ukraine. So I have two wonderful guests here. I've had Will Poole and both Jimmie on the program before. Jimmie Moglia is from Italy, and I've got to kind of put my granny glasses on so I can read my phone because I forgot to bring a printout. Let me see if I've got it all here. Yeah, Jimmie, you don't put too much of a bio up there, but you were born in Torino, Italy, resident now of Portland. I know you're an author. I've been on your program. You were a host of your own cable program. You're an inventor, I know that. Social critic, and hosted a series of Ukraine historical sketches, which I posted, which were 4 parts on YouTube. And you told me now that you have 6, and you're going to be editing those.
5 is on, and the 6 is the final. And after that, no more about Ukraine.
Okay. And then we have Will Poole, who I've known for years now. And Will is a World War II veteran, member of Veterans for Peace. He was AOM 3C Navy flight crew. In addition, Will spent another 4 years on inactive duty, and Will has been protesting U.S. military and war policies for most of the past 65 years, and goes by Will Poole, 2 4-letter words. And Will is also a member of Veterans for Peace Chapter 72, the same one I'm involved with. and also an activist with Jobs for Justice, the Portland Central American Solidarity Committee, and Will has been sort of our historian for keeping us straight on some of these issues. So I kind of want to get into this a little bit. Jimmie, I want to go to you first because you were doing these historical programs. And
Yes.
sort of, I mean, I was looking at part 3 of the program, and you talked about this going back to Ukraine. You almost had to look at 1,000 years back to see how that came to this, where we are today. Can you just give us a little brief history here?
I'll try to be as concise as possible, and I want to also to live with
Yes.
So, to condense 1,000 years of history in 2-3 minutes, of course, one has to leave out a substantial amount of information. But there is a main theme that it goes through this, and I think that most of people know it about it. So, if somebody knows it, I apologize because I know it already. But the Ukraine was born, as we can call it, Ukraine was called as a state of so-called Kievan Rus. Kievan is in Kiev and Rus is in Russia. So to begin with, at the origin of this particular country, independent country today, there is a conflux of two cultures that are, to say the least, symbiotic. And the languages are almost the same. In fact, until the 19th century, the Ukrainian language was called Little Rus or Little Russian. And it was the merit or the responsibility or the guts of the most prominent Ukrainian poet of the 19th century to ensure that the Ukrainian language would have a place of its own in its history.
And the poet's name?
Shevchenko.
How do you spell, how do you spell that?
Shevchenko. It's a Russian spelling, so S-C-H-E-V-C-H-E-N-K-O, Shevchenko.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Then, again, I'm skipping a lot. Notwithstanding the efforts of this particular Shevchenko, plus another large number of intellectuals, and through the various gyrations of history that are affected and affected by world events, etc. Ukraine as a nation, as a republic, never came into being, except, and I'm jumping quite a bit, after World War I, after the turmoil that lasted for a good 3 years until 1920-22. Finally, in 1922, there was the formal establishment of the Soviet Ukrainian National Republic. And by paradox, or through a paradox, the real resurgence or cultivation or development of Ukrainian local culture in all its aspects, including the language, including literature, music, art of all sorts, came in that period from between 1923 and 1929. Then there was, again I'm jumping quite a bit, there was the period that we normally associate with the famine, with the Great Famine in Ukraine, was also the period where throughout the West we had the Great Depression. That is so. And during the period, the Ukrainization, if we want to call it that way, was somewhat abated. Then everything was taken over or overcome by World War II, and after World War II there was there was a period of great resurgence and development, and it was quite dramatic. In 4 years, even though there was an Iron Curtain by now, after the war, they recovered everything we were able to produce, and before they were surpassing the previous war. Then, well, after the death of Stalin, and then there was Khrushchev, was almost a Ukrainian Khrushchev. The process of re-Ukrainization started again, and again we could go into why this. It doesn't matter. As far as the local people were concerned, again, instruction in both languages, emphasis on developing culture and things like this, culture and literature, art.
You talked about nationalism and how sort of nationalism begins as sort of these parallels between intellectual nationalism and romantic nationalism.
There are, yes, again, there are many nationalisms.
Yeah.
And again, but the nationalism of the 1800, there were two types. There was a nationalism. I don't want to tell me when you want to stop because we could go
ahead for a second.
There was a nationalism of which means of the type that you can be part of a nation, a compatible nationalism and incompatible nationalism, meaning if I am in the instance, if I am a Ukrainian, I cannot be a Russian. This was the tenet of the idea held by this Shevchenko guy. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Lenin type of nationalism said there are two types of nationalism, the nationalism of the oppressor and the nationalism of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. The nationalism of the oppressed is the one that we have to fight.
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the nationalism of the that he envisioned was such that you can have a variety of nationalities in the same area, each one maintaining its own independence and development of thought, without having a conflict with the idea they were part of the same group, because this was a unified a socialist country. And in this context, and I finish here because I don't want to make it a monologue, in this context it has to be seen the quote-unquote the gift that Khrushchev made of Crimea to the Ukraine in 1963 or 64 was to show the affection of the Russian people for the Ukrainian. At least this is what has gone in history as that.
Mm-hmm. And just to carry one more thing, you said that you studied in, went to school in the Ukraine, or you were?
Oh, no. Oh. I went to school in Italy, but
and then
my experience with the Ukraine is incidental. I through college I maintained myself. I've been a guitarist, and I have to blush now. I was singing guitarist, singing country and western songs, so you can imagine. So in one of the gigs that I had, I was on a cruise. The three cruises in Russia. One to Odessa, which is Ukraine, one to Yalta, which is Crimea, now is Crimea, and one to Sochi, which was Russia. And through that time, which was one long, maybe a week at a time, but it's much better than nothing, so I was able to form an idea of how people live, how people think, and how they interact with other people. Anecdotal, because you asked me. Mm-hmm. I still remember in Yalta, because it was an interesting for me anecdote. I had a guide with me because I don't speak Russian, and as we were strolling along the seaside, very pleasant, there was I appeared as a foreigner, so we were stopped by a fairly burly man, and they exchanged some words with the guide. At one point, this burly man lifts me up and from nowhere and puts me down. And so I asked the guy what happened. He asked me what nationality you told me. He asked me if you were German, and I told him that you were not. So he was so happy that I wasn't a German that he lifted me up and put it down. So it gives you an idea. But I don't want to stop here because there is Will here.
Yes, no, we want to talk to Will here. Now, Will, of course, we've already mentioned that you're a World War II veteran, but I've known you, so we've had to. I mean, Will will be in our meetings, and when we're talking about some of these issues, he all of a sudden will give us a history lesson about what's going on in the world, and but when the issue of the Ukraine came up, Will, especially when we start talking about the idea that, I remember in the beginning, the issues came on the news that, they were talking about the Ukraine, whether it was going to go with the European Union or go with Russia, and it had to be this sort of, if you went with Russia, the sort of a bailout for their economy. that they had to go along with the austerity programs, and Russia was offering a different kind of deal. They chose to go with Russia, and then all of a sudden we have this coup attempt. And who are the people? Who are the players in there? Because that was the first thing you started telling us. We should know who these people are.
Well, there's an awful lot. He went through a lot of things here I could add to. I've got to say a couple of things.
Sure.
Initially, Kiev was called the mother of all Russian cities. So it wasn't until the Soviet period that Russia, White Russia, and the Ukraine were recognized as separate entities. In actual fact, were created in 1922, I believe it was, in that very early period of the Soviet Union. The other thing, the differences linguistically between Russian, White Russian, and Ukrainian, those were not recognized until 1917. So we get into this business of the Ukraine as an entity, as we think of it today. It's fairly recent evolution. There's another thing behind when we're thinking of Britain, France, even Italy, for an example. We're thinking of areas generally, and to some extent Germany. There are all sorts of things we can say about that one. Areas that are easily definable. This is not true of the Ukraine. So much of this is open plain, of ebb and flow of people back and forth, and the boundaries have been set largely from the outside. This was not something that came up so much from the inside. He mentioned the linguistic and literary and artistic development, which was always blurred, but there was always this nationalist element. Now I have to come to World War II and emphasize something, and this is a historical thing. Unless you understand the differences between them, it doesn't make too much sense. But there's a huge difference between the Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukraine. That has to do with the religious background of the people, the Eastern Ukraine, Russian Orthodox recognition. The Western Ukraine has this seems silly, but they have the similar right, but recognize the Pope and the Catholic Church. Western Ukraine has always had, historically, along with Poland, a history of terrible anti-Semitism. And during World War II, and again, when we mention World War II, we have to mention bring up one fact that's extremely important to understand Russian psychology, particularly the establishment people are in it. Russia was invaded 3 times from the West in 35 years. They haven't forgotten that. We had our own troops on Russian soil in 1919, took part in the counter-revolution, and so this isn't completely forgotten by the Russians. Russians are traditionally been terribly pro-American, and I have to say this, my reception, the 8 times I was there over various periods of time, was always extremely warm and hospitable. I have a very special feeling about the people in Russia and also the Ukraine, because I've been in Kiev a couple of times, Kharkov even, which is Kharkiv in Ukrainian, and so on. So we come back to World War II. There was a Nazi puppet state in the Western Ukraine, and they developed a division. Sometimes it's called the Ukrainian 10th Division, sometimes the Galician, which fought with Nazi Germany and held together. And interesting, they ended up surrendering the remnants of that in Italy. Did you know about that? You're familiar with that thing. To our troops, to American troops. I had a brother-in-law who was 7 years older than I, that served with the 10th Mountain Brigade in Italy, right on up through there. And he was there when these Ukrainians surrendered. By the way, there was an Italian film, I've forgotten the name of it, 2 women involved in it, which one of them commented on the beauty of the Ukrainians there that they were meeting. So this is part of the history, this intense nationalism coming down. Now, let's come down to, I'm going to have to cut in and say something here, otherwise you can't understand my position.
Yeah.
At the end of World War II, the United States found itself the most powerful country in the world, tremendous armed force and so on, and nuclear energy and all that thing that went with it. The genesis of U.S. foreign policy is maintain that military supremacy throughout the planet regardless. And you can't understand American foreign policy unless you understand that. And to maintain this, it means you have to put down any possible challenge to it, and wherever possible, take advantage of the opportunities and make the very most of it. Well, the Ukraine was what Nazi Germany wanted more than anything else, with its tremendous wheat fields and all the rest of it that went with it. So this is a prize to come into the Western section, something to be added on to our sphere of influence. Now we have to mention two things here, coming back to that. And this is Bush I administration, when Jack Matlock was our ambassador to Russia for 4 years, from 1987 to 1991. Gorbachev, when he withdrew Russian troops from Eastern Europe, was given the assurances by our ambassador, Jack Matlock, and backed up by the Bush administration, that NATO forces would not move into Eastern Europe. And that's how a very good relationship, actually, relations between the former Soviet Union and the United States improved considerably under both Reagan and Bush.
Right.
You know, this is another thing. Clinton came into power in 1991, and that whole thing went out. There was, you know, NATO started moving eastward, and of course there were genuine fears by people like the Estonian, Latvians, Lithuanians, and so on, who have been under Russian-controlled influence. But there was no real negotiations to neutralize these areas militarily. Came the, I believe it was 2004, the Orange Revolution, you know, a whole series of these things. Our State Department, all of our usual people who interfere in these things were there. That means the United States Agency for International Development, Endowment for Democracy, the International Democratic Institute. You can go on and on and on, and players in there. All right. So this was, again, a destabilizing element. And then we come to 2013 and the outbreak when Viktor Yanukovych was going to make agreements with Moscow, but the Western Ukrainian element, other elements, here we get in the complexities of the collapse of former Soviet Union and the spreading out and seizure of powers by oligarchs, you might say, people who like Petro, his name is president of the Ukraine, Slate, and of course I'm very old. So anyway, all of our usual suspects went into action right away. That means the Endowment for Democracy and United States Agency for International Development, on. And our State Department people started showing up regularly. Victoria Nuland, okay, things will begin to come back. Victoria Nuland, John McCain, John Kerry, Vice President Biden, and so on. You can go right on into this. And the worst element that came out of this whole mix, and it's impossible to tell who was responsible for what, because you get these things going and they just simply roll. So one of the things that shows up, of course, are pictures of the puppet Nazi government, and these are Ukrainian national heroes, and they're plastered over the buildings in Kiev. And even And the symbols,
Right.
begin to appear all over. The same
Swastika.
symbols that were used during the period of the puppet government in Western Ukraine during World War II. So again, you have to take account for this. It was never certain who was shooting whom at times. The Estonian ambassador even testified to that. And there's been a lot of speculation exactly how this thing got stirred up to the point it did. Well, things of Poroshenko, Petro Poroshenko, this is what happens when you get very, very old. And you have to forgive me for it. These things don't come
as far
back
as I'm concerned,
too
he
well.
is the director. As far as I'm concerned, you're doing very well.
I've got to make one last thing about World War II, being a World War II vet. The European phase of that, the Russians took 80% of the casualties. And it wasn't until the defeat of the Nazis at Stalingrad, 1942-43, that we opened the second front in 1944. We had said initially 1942, that was probably too early, but 43 would have been possible. And that was passed over, and the story is that it was Churchill that delayed it, got in the way of that thing in 1944. So to Russians, anyone who studies that history, it looks awful suspicious because here their troops are moving west in a hurry, and all of a sudden we open up the second front that's been delayed at least one full year. I visited my first time there, Piskoretskaya Kladbishche in was present-day St. Petersburg, Ming burial ground. 450,000 people buried in that. So you have to consider things like this when you're thinking of Russian concern over the movement of NATO, not just through Latvia and Lithuania, but through the Ukraine, into the eastern Ukraine, and right smack up on to what mounts to the front doorstep of the Russian Republic. Now, regardless of the feelings of Russian people, the Russian establishment certainly is very much aware of this, and it takes a very jaundiced view, and I think that's perfectly understandable.
Well, that's
I should add one thing about the threat to arm the Ukrainians.
Yes.
This is like throwing gasoline into the fire. John Sawyer, an M16, that's the British intelligence retired person, warned against this type of activity. Jack Matlock did too. So when I say this is a bad idea, I think you get out of it. It's a very bad idea, and I've been very happy to see the French and the Germans in there involved heavily in the negotiation over the Ukraine. That's the way it should be. Forget us. It's a European problem, and I'm sounding like 100% American when I say that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that just recently, I think today I posted on Facebook was this piece by Wesley Clark, who, of course, was in Serbia and the commander who supposedly saved Europe from Milosevic and the slaughter and ethnic cleansing of Serbians. But I mean, he's. I don't even know the whole story there, but the whole thing is that he came back a hero on that, and he ran as a sort of a candidate for president at one point, and was considered the Democratic general with a progressive sort of mind. But in this article, he's going along with the same theory that we're hearing in the news all the time right now, and that is he mentioned places like Rwanda, when Rwanda had the horrible slaughter by the Hutus against the Tutsis, and this mass genocide took place, and the world was crying, we have to do something. And I felt we had to do something too. I felt everybody does. We don't want to see people murdered and slaughtered and genocide. We want to do something. But then what happens when we get involved? That's the next question. But at the whole time in this whole article, and he's saying that there's a bloodbath going on, and there's horrible pictures if you're watching what's happening in the Ukraine, people killing each other, and these horrible. You mentioned it earlier to me. People's heads blowing up, and all of it's just horrible images. And nobody wants to see anybody killed, but there's no good guys in these wars. There's no good war. The thing that upset me about it is there's no history involved by why we are even there, why this is even happening, is what you two are bringing to the table, which I think is so important.
No, I think there is a very important thing that happened there, from in my opinion anyway.
Yeah.
It's also very obvious that until 10 or 15 years ago, I hate to use the word the mantra, anyway, the general field for all this antagonism, for all the military operations and the enormous defense budget was not for maintaining supremacy of the United States, but was for defending against communism.
You mentioned that.
Whereas now, although it is not said, and it is often what I think the truth in what is not said rather than what is said. Behind all this parade of Putin and everything else, it goes by the wayside the fact, the reality that you have a capitalist front or country deploying all sorts of gargantuan military hardware and software these days, and military and people, against a capitalist country, which then, from the point of view of history, makes the whole 50 years of Cold War a farce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because had it not been a farce, well, this would not happen.
When there World War I?
So at this point, one could go back and say, it's when, as you probably know better than I do, but when the World War II ended, there was the good Stalin, who was a Georgian, of course, and they said, okay, this is going to be our sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. On the east side, we will have our influence. On the west side, we will have our influence. Now, of course, depending on the parish that one belongs to, you will have people, but yeah, there was not freedom and this. Yes, it was controlled, and depending on how you look at it, you may have not liked it or you may have not liked it. However, I still remember the only president of the United States that made this statement. I still remember that statement, and that's maybe one of the reasons why they chucked him out. Jimmy Carter said at one point, some people prefer to have stability in their life at the cost of the risk of not getting fortune. Some other people prefer not to have stability, but they want to have the risk of becoming fortunate. Mm-hmm. This was a very, I would say, courageous statement from a U.S. president, because unwritten in any book, the real philosophy of life is I am going to conquer the world, and if you are on my way, I put you aside, and unless you are caught by the justice system. So I say this because it's part of the philosophy that was held as extant and valid and to be implemented for 50 years, which has been proven, as I said, ridiculous.
Well, and that's certainly true. I think I agree with you there. One of the things I wanted to mention about Wesley Clark, though, is that they didn't talk about the fascism that they were supporting, these Nazi fascists in the coup. That's left out of all.
They would support the Hutus, the Tutsis.
Yeah.
They would support anyone.
There you go. If it was to their benefit.
Because it's to their benefit.
Yes.
And we've seen it now in so many ways that it doesn't no longer. It no longer provides a sense of shock.
Yeah.
And as far as the as the Nazis are concerned, this is absolutely it is a quite remarkable thing to have to bring back these banderas, these Joseph. But at the beginning, interrupt me because now you're going to. At the beginning of World War II, when Germany invaded Poland and then invaded Western Ukraine, there arose these two groups of so-called nationalists. Let's call them fascists to identify them. There was one with the bandera, which took the inspiration from Hitler, and there was another guy whose name escapes me now, who took the inspiration from Mussolini. They fought each other, killed a few among them, and eventually this bandera emerged as victor in this nationalist pro-Nazi. Except that the Nazis really, he got on the nerves of the Nazis too. So they didn't kill him, but they sent him back to Berlin. So the fact that there was this small, relatively speaking, small pro-Nazi element should not be taken. Of course, it doesn't matter. People do what they want, but it is unusual, and it is also funny that tragically funny that they should be now held as a symbol of Ukrainian independence, where they were symbol of Ukrainian dependence to Hitler, which most of us would agree was not a very good idea.
Well, and I mean, we have to also look at this, how this affects us. This is not just the Ukraine. Ukraine is a center in which right now a battle is being fought out, which could lead, I mean, everything I'm hearing is this rumbling of Third World War. And is that, I mean, Will, do you have something to say on that?
Well, very, very much so, because our entire society is held together fundamentally by these huge military expenditures. They go into every aspect: food, clothing, shelter, and so on.
Right.
And there has to be justification for these people on top. And you go right through the top military as they retire out. So many of them end up as advisors in various economic groups that are essentially sucking the blood out of our society through the military expenditures. Where a 3- or 4-star general used to retire on his pension and play golf and so on, now they go to work for these private corporations that oftentimes are making 7-figure salaries. So it's a great piggy bank for the people on top. And of course, the most effective means of social control in the Nazis, by the way, I should mention that I always bring this up. Hitler said in the 1920s, if we are to succeed, we must develop the techniques of American advertisers. Public opinion is a manufactured product.
Right.
It's not something just all of a sudden occurs in the type of society we are. So again, we get back into this. Well, the greatest means of social control is fear.
Right.
Scare the hell out of them. And of course, one of the points that I make at our meetings is we lost World War II, which shocks people. You know, we defeated the Nazis. Look how we came out. Man, look at our military. No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, of course, is the Second Bill of Rights that was promulgated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the State of the Union address on January 11th, 1944. 1941, excuse me. I make a mistake now and then. 1941. Well, this was an extension of the New Deal. So what were we supposed to have? It was health care from womb to tomb and free education from preschool through college, university, a decent place to live for everyone. You know, there's to be no more 1/3 of the nation ill-housed, ill-fed, and ill-cared for. All that was good. And the whole personnel, everything changed from that. And it was lost. You know, Gore Vidal, one of our famous World War II authors, said, Harry Truman did more damage to this country than any president in history, and it's true because the entire military-industrial complex was set up under Truman. The reforms, the centralized commands, and the rest of basically that command, by the way, was laid out not to extend our power, but George C. Marshall to make the thing a little more efficient and guard against corruption, which of course you can't guard against corruption with any military establishment. So the setup for that 1947 is an extremely important year because that was the year when the integrated armed forces came together. No more War Department, Navy Department, and so on. It was now defense. I liked War Department. That to me was a wonderful term. 1947, to give you an idea of the way this thing works, Truman did his greatest civil rights thing. He desegregated the armed forces. This wasn't as generous as it sounds like because he needed to up the pool reserve of manpower for the military, and this was a very easy jump. You could, as you examine the psychology and the way our system has functioned from the end of the Second World War on, I'm tempted to go into Potsdam. I'm not going to go in. The dropping of the atomic bomb, you know, that whole thing. We don't have time for it. But anyway, this is the way you build a huge military apparatus, and it has a way of, it becomes an organism, and it grows and grows, and it has a way of making policy that affects every single one of us, every institution.
Before you begin, I want to make an announcement here too, because if we want to put that up, Kelly, if you're in there, I'm gonna be doing a as an announcement. I'm going to be interviewed on KBOO Radio Monday, Prison Pipeline, and I'll be talking about veterans courts and veterans prisons. We have a number of veterans that, you know, because of their post-traumatic stress and other issues, end up even BTI, brain injury. They end up getting in trouble and end up going to prisons. There have been some other solutions that are being done throughout the country called veterans courts, where they're doing more therapy and putting them in isolation away from the regular prison population. There are different qualifications, but I'll be talking about that on KBOO on Monday at 6:30 to 7 on KBOO 90.7 FM. Adam Carpinelli will be doing the interview with me. He's worked with the Jubilee movement and a number of issues with writing to prisoners. So I'm sure he's going to have a lot of questions for me, and I'm doing a lot of my research. I've talked about it before, but I think it's an important program, and I'd like you to get on board. There's another thing I wanted to just mention to people, and that's because I think I mentioned it before that I work with full disclosure, and I also worked with the issue of Agent Orange. The Nation has just put out its issue was March 16th, but I think it's just coming out on the bookshelves. That is called "The Legacy of the Vietnam War." 40 years after its end, the Vietnamese are still coping with unexploded bombs and Agent Orange by George Black. And one of the people I work very closely who lives in Vietnam, Chuck Searchy, is being interviewed on this program, and I just think that people should pick this article up if you can, get a chance to read that. If you go to VFP, our national website, you can go on full disclosure, and they have that posted there. And so it'll be a great opportunity for you to read that program. Okay, now we'll just get back to the program. I know you have something to add.
Oh, no, I wanted to add something that, two things. It is natural, and because you cannot look at history as a whole, you have to consider it in chunk. It is natural to consider or to believe that I would say the warmongering, the military tendency of the United States is an after World War II phenomenon. But I'm not original in this, of course, but the imperialistic strain goes back a long, long time before.
Right.
And only just to get there, of course, there's a question of the Philippine War in 1898, and then there's the question of the the invasion of Cuba, and the extraordinary participation of the United States to World War I, where there was no absolute reason whatsoever, because there wasn't even the 1917 revolution where they could say, well, they're communists, so we must kill them. No, so it was absolute no reason whatsoever except for the interest that is part of the capitalistic system. The other thing is that it has been observed before, except I haven't heard it said this way. With the system, as Will was saying, that you have the accumulation of wealth associated with the military and all the satellite programs, including the CIA. We are come to the point where you have a kind of a reverse feudalism, because in the feudalism you had the church, the military, and everyone else who supported work to allow them to
give them power.
Give them power.
Yeah.
Today you have the finance, the military, and everyone else who works to give them power. So it's a kind of a feudalism towards that direction. As far as the World War III, I do not think it will develop that way, particularly because from what I hear, from what we read, and from various sources. The Russians are pretty strong. Even now, even in Ukraine, when you have all the West and everything else, they've been completely destroyed the so-called Ukrainian. Plus, there is, from what I read, from what we can hear, there is considerable reluctance even among the Ukrainians to go to answer the call for the draft.
Yeah,
so,
but is there a restraint by the U.S.? That's the issue.
But what they were they've already you mentioned Ukraine, but unbeknown to most of us, because there are military bases in Uzbekistan, there are military in Turkmenistan, in Afghanistan, so all over the place. What they may try to do, although the Russians have learned the lesson in Chechnya, they may try to use some of the local elements, the local hooligans or whatever, to destabilize the country. But I don't think they'll be very successful. By looking at what happened in Ukraine, it's really a horrible thing, but I'm quite a little bit more optimistic now towards the sense that there may be a gradual, very, very gradual shift towards Russia and China, even from some corners in Europe. Although it would be fought tooth and nail, it would be very hard for people to, and also because, I'll finish this, one of the most beautiful things that happened in the last few years has been WikiLeaks.
Yes.
Because with WikiLeaks, you read the real stuff. So you cannot say, oh, you think this way because you are a capitalist, you think this. No, this is black and white.
That's where my nose started.
Very well. So with WikiLeaks has shown, without contestation whatsoever, that all governments in Western Europe, and probably in other places as well, are under absolute control from the United States. And it is not that they say, oh, I'm going to controlling you, but they have a file on each one of the potential candidates, and they start working on them before even they get into government, by bribing them, give them public relations or stuff, even chairs. In fact, frankly, some of the people that speak on television in Europe are ridiculous to think that they are teaching, but it doesn't matter. They are in the limelight, and so there is such a control of the United States, of the CIA, on the embassies, on who gets elected or who gets quote unquote, and they're no longer elections now because they're all. So that it would be very difficult for Europe to districate itself. But there is some rumor at the moment. But I don't think they will risk World War III, because eventually some of them may get killed too.
Yeah. I was just going to say too. I remember, there was Peter. Ufanov, the actor.
Ustinov?
Yeah, who once said, you know, that these countries want to rule everything, let them, because every time they want to rule everything, they absolutely collapse because you can't control everything, you know? And it just seems like that's what's happening in the world right now. You have all these people that just constantly want more, more, more. There was another article that I posted today that was about the economy, you know, and they put one of the first things that they just kind of headed off with was that before it held off when we had these great benefits of, you know, the things you were talking about like health care and various things. And that wasn't perfect, but we had, you know, we did have a modicum of a great economy for a period of time.
Well, actually, in Oregon and Washington, a good share of the smaller institutions for higher learning were free.
Yeah.
Well,
let me finish this, though, Will, and then we'll go back to that. Well, the thing is that they were saying that what the capitalists are saying now is that, you know, we gave that to you as a concession because you had Russia and we didn't want people to go into communism, right? So that's a concession. Communism's gone. We want it back. We want it all back now. And that was the premise of the article. That's and go ahead. Just let you go.
Yeah, a couple of contemporary things to say about both Ukraine and Russia. The political systems in Ukraine is classically very much fragmented. Poroshenko has a bloc, and but I think even the last election that was held, they only had, what was it, 35% or something of the vote. So there are all these little groups and these extremely intense national groups like the Svoboda and the second sector, about 1% support. And as I recall, Yulia Tymoshenko's little party, I think it's called the Fatherland, only got about 12% of the vote, something like that. Mm-hmm. So you get this, well, there's a similar fracturing in Russia itself. At the present time, Putin essentially is behaving according to old Russian tradition. You operate in control of the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is the thing that's really important, and that dates all the way from Peter the Great down to the present time. That's the way you got to say. And one last remark about Stalin. He got his power because no one disliked him. Everyone liked him. He was easygoing. All the rest of them, you know, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and so on. They all had their, these guys that were intellectuals with their own little plot of ground, and Stalin was pleasant, very amiable, so he got to be Secretary General of the Communist Party, which was a bureaucratic job. No one wanted it. So how does Putin get his job? He was the only one really capable at the time of managing the bureaucracy. There's a moral for everyone, including people in our country.
We're almost at the end of the program. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you guys, we'll be closing out here shortly. First of all, I want to just thank you both for being here. The second is that, do you have a question for each other? Is there a question you want to hear to get from one of?
Are you pessimistic or optimistic?
Well, I think to survive, and I ask myself this question all the time: what am I doing here? Everyone else is gone now.
Well,
but you know, I have a degree of optimism because, for an example, this month in Tunis will be the World Social Forum. And of course, we have social forums that will be going on in November here. So there's grassroots element underneath it. And this type of thing is totally unpredictable because human beings are basically emotional creatures. And when you try to rationalize and draw out a plan and a path, it's going to blow up right in your face.
I'm just saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if 5%, 10% of the population had the same interest. It's interest, it's nothing else. Interest in following up these things and forming his own idea. Because no ideas, we cannot say I'm right. I'm tentatively voicing my opinion, but it would be wonderful to have that.
I'm usually right, but
Of course.
but and do you have a question for him, for Jimmie?
Yes. Do you really think that human beings can control the type of technology that they're developing, or is this going completely out of control?
It's a very wide question. I think that
We have about 1 minute.
okay. No, it's a very wide question. So I will answer very quick. As long as the concept of technology are maintained within certain limits, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. It is when you say we cannot do it because the technology doesn't allow us to do it, then it becomes bad. But otherwise, I think it's a wonderful thing.
Well, here we have, when you talk about, we lost a lot of things from Vietnam to the present, and WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning, who became Chelsea Manning. All of these people,
technologies allow us to WikiLeaks.
that's right. Technology allowed us to talk. It allowed for revolutions, like in Egypt and a number of places. People are communicating with each other. It's allowed us to find alternative media. You talked about, what was the Russian stations that you said that people...
Russia Today.
Russia Today.
Which is not Russia, it's all Americans. But it's very objective, and in fact, they are quite scared. The beauty of the stuff, it's not put up. There is not a lot of public relations, so it's a very, very visual. There's also a site called the Vineyard of the Saker. Look for Saker, and it's a very Saker. It's a
okay.
And find it because it's a very informative website on all sorts of things that happen in the world. It's not from Russia; it's from Miami, because there's a connection all over the world. You get information which normally you don't find, and you get a point of view which is not Fox News or whatever.
Now you have your own website, is that right?
YourDailyShakespeare.com.